Hey folks, this month's chatty tutorial video is going to be a broad overview of an aspect of my playing style that I think gets the most questions and comments, and that is my right hand technique. So I'm going to go over my nail care, my positioning, my hybrid approach, and my influences. I'll discuss some classical exercises that I think are great for developing and maintaining your finger strength and independence. And lastly, I've tried to distill a bunch of what I do into a handful of picking patterns that you can practice and isolate and hopefully be better prepared to play my arrangements, as well as hopefully adapt for your own. Now, in case you want to skip ahead to your topic of interest, timestamps are in the description and the top comment below. Now, first up, let's talk nail care. So this question comes up all the time, and the short answer is yes, I play with nails, and no, I don't do anything to reinforce them. Now, should you grow your nails out? Personally, I do think that in order to get any degree of clear, bright attack, you do need to have some nails. I just don't feel like I've really heard a lot of people who play with strictly their fingertips get the kind of clear tone that at least I'm looking for from instrumental fingerstyle guitar, but obviously taste can vary. That said, I am proof that you don't necessarily need to grow out super long, eye-catching nails that require a ton of maintenance. I personally keep mine on the shorter side, playing with a mix of fingertip and nail, and I use these check glass nail files to shape them every couple of days or so. Keeping them shorter helps to prevent breakage, plus it's the tone that I prefer, and they don't interfere with typing or anything else that I do. Scott Tennant's book Pumping Nylon has some guides to shaping them, as do some other classical books, but personally I found that those guides didn't really work for steel string, and I just had to experiment to see what actually worked best for me. Now fortunately, it's been ages since I broke a nail, but usually when I have in the past, what I'll do is just super glue everything back together until I've got a break between gigs long enough where I can chop it off and let it grow back. Beyond that, I don't really do anything. I don't take any special supplements. I don't eat a special diet. I'm actually, I eat less protein probably than a lot of people because I'm mostly plant-based. And so I think at this point, it's just lucky genes. I do accept that probably in 5 to 10 years, I'll have to start reinforcing them in some way. And for that, I have acrylic nails or maybe silk sheets layered with super glue on my radar as a possibility. But if you have any suggestions, let me know. Now, I will say, while I am perfectly satisfied with the tone that I get, whenever Matt Thomas and I are at Cedar Rock and I get to hear the same guitar in my hands, then hear it in his hands, I'm always really impressed by the amount of tone and volume that he gets. And he does use reinforced nails. If you are someone who is solely focused on solo instrumental fingerstyle guitar and you want to have the option of incorporating some percussive techniques or being really aggressive, and if you want to do 3+ hour long ass gigs on a regular basis, I do kind of think it might be a non-negotiable to have fortified reinforced nails of some sort. I just don't think that natural nails are going to hold up to a really aggressive attack for many, many hours every week. So that is something to consider, but I am proof that you can make natural nails work for you, especially if you're like me and you have a softer attack and you maybe incorporate some flat pick use and use amplification as well. Now, when it comes to right hand position, there are a number of different approaches that you can take, as you've probably already seen watching loads of different players. Personally, I happen to take some classical courses at a pivotal time in my development, so that's what I gravitated towards, even as I wasn't really playing classical music and as I switched more to steel string. Elements of this approach include a more rounded draping wrist shape where each finger is equally at the ready and you can grab 4 notes at once easily. The resting position is very loose and tension-free. The part of the fingers making contact with the strings is the outer left quadrant if you're looking down at your nails, or if you're looking at yourself in a playing position, it kind of looks like you're coming inward. Contrast that to the more parallel to the strings approach that many folks use, especially those who play with thumbpicks, where they're maybe even resting the heel of their hand on the strings or the bridge. The more rounded classical approach, I think, puts the ring finger in a stronger position, and I find I have better balance between all 4 fingers like this, but that could also just be that's how my muscles have developed. Now I'm going to get into a potentially rather contentious topic, and that is the issue of pinky anchoring. As you can probably already see, I don't anchor my pinky or any part of my hand at all. With my hand in that ready-to-play classical position, it's actually kind of inconvenient and uncomfortable for me to try to anchor the pinky, plus I just don't find any need to anchor because each finger is always hovering over the string where it's needed. Alright, so now that we're into contentious territory, I'll go on my little bit of a soapbox, but first I'll say, I'm not trying to take pinky anchoring away from anybody. There are plenty of great players who use it and it works for them, and if it works for you, if your style is well established and you like doing it and it's not causing you any tension or issues, stick with it. I don't want to act like it's not a valid approach, because it totally is. That being said, I do have pretty strong feelings that one should not do it. And especially if you're in that early learning stage where you either haven't developed that habit or maybe you've started, but you're not really super set in your ways yet, I think it's good to put a little bit of extra effort into breaking that habit, because in the long term, I think you're just going to have more possibilities in terms of what you can do with your right hand. And at least for me, I know it causes a little bit of tension to try to do it. So you might also be saving yourself some trouble down the road. And sort of similar to the nails versus no nails issue, my thought is, to me, all my favorite fingerstylists for the most part don't anchor at all. So I want to emulate those guys because I want to be able to do what they can do. My other argument against anchoring your pinky is that the ulnar nerve and tendon that connects into your ring finger also connects the pinky finger. And if you try, you should find that it's very hard to move only one of those fingers, but not the other. They generally want to move together. If I try to do it on my left hand, I have a little bit more flexibility and independence between them because those muscles are obviously more developed from fretting. But on my right hand, I really can't move them independently at all. They curve and they straighten together. So if you're anchoring your pinky, there's a good chance you're limiting the range of motion of your ring finger. As you'll see, if I try to sort of hold this one straight and then curve my ring finger down, it just doesn't want to curve as much as it does if it's moving freely with the pinky. So my thought again there is that if the pinky is free and loose, it will just move along with the ring finger without touching any strings, and it allows the ring finger to have maximum range of motion. Lastly, for me at least, trying to anchor feels like it causes a little bit of tension, which is never a good thing. And maybe that's more of an issue for a small-handed person than it would be for somebody with super long spider fingers, where your fingers maybe do just naturally rest on the soundboard, but it's again something to consider. So the TLDR on this for me is preferably don't anchor, but if you must or if you like to, just make sure it's not causing you any tension. So we've discussed wrist shape and lack of anchor, so the last component is where am I attacking the strings between the sound hole and the bridge. Personally, I feel you get the best overall bassline tone right here, just below the sound hole, and that's where I'm aiming both when I'm playing fingerstyle and when I'm playing with a pick. Over the sound hole, it's a bit more warm and diffuse, and the tension of the strings feels a little bit more slack. Whereas by the bridge, you get a more compressed nasally sound and a stiffer feel in the strings. Being right here below the sound hole, I find I prefer the balance of warmth to clarity, and that it suits just about everything that I want to play. You can certainly tap into those other timbres, but I would just say to do it with purpose. Now overall, I've stuck with this approach for so long because it's relaxed, it's fluid, it's easy, and it helps me to achieve the sustain and the warmth that I'm looking for when I play. It's also never given me any issues in terms of tension or repetitive stress injuries, and I find that if I do want to mix it up a little bit and play with more percussive elements or anything like that, it's quite easy to do that. So I think it's a great all-purpose approach. When it comes to my style with guitar, I think of myself as a sort of generalist with probably a bit more classical influence than is typical. Over the years, I've learned arrangements from John Renbourn, James Taylor, Paul Simon, Bert Jansch, Davy Graham, Joan Baez, Pierre Bensusan, among others, and all that has sort of factored into the way that I play and has resulted in a style that has a lot of elements of Travis picking, as well as more generic arpeggiated patterns and different elements of Celtic influence as well. So I wouldn't consider myself an expert on any one style, but I am continuing to develop my own technique by further studying and fortifying my alternating bass patterns, my Travis picking, and I've been digging more into Carcassi etudes lately, where there's a lot more single note runs and some unexpected right hand fingerings, all of which is continuing to change and update the way that I think about my right hand and the individual roles that each finger can play and all of what's possible. So that leads me to the next topic, which is four-finger playing. So I am a four-finger player, and a lot of my playing comes down to assigning the thumb to the low E, A, and D strings, the index to the G, the middle to the B, and the ring to the high E. I think this is a great starting point with the understanding that these rules, quote unquote, can be and at times should be broken. Now, a little confession here. For ages, I have been so focused on making sure my ring finger is as strong as or can get at least similar tone to the other three fingers that I honestly didn't really know that some patterns were just better played with a three-finger approach. For example, a D chord with this standard pattern. Now you can of course do that with the four-finger assignment method, but you lose the rhythmic pulse of the thumb being the one to hit the bass notes on the 1 and the 3. So we're not taking the ring finger out here because it's weaker, we're taking it out to keep the other fingers playing the same role in the pattern and maintaining the drive. So what I've realized after way too many years of playing is that while yes, we want to have a strong ring finger and we want to find ways to challenge it and strengthen it, which we'll talk about later, ultimately the main drivers functionally in a lot of the music that we play are these three fingers, the thumb, the index, and the middle, which are handling the bulk of the work with the bass and the mids, while the ring finger really comes into play more for melody and fills. So it's totally okay that sometimes these three fingers are doing most of the work. Now briefly, I'll touch on two topics that I won't really dig into in this video because I'm not an expert on them and not even a frequent user on them, and that is playing with a thumb pick and hybrid picking. Now, thumb pick use I've gotten into a little bit now that I finally have one that fits me. But personally, I have found that the change that is required to make everything else work, so basically, as we discussed, I have that more rounded approach, but when you use the thumb pick, you have to bring the wrist in kind of more parallel, or the hand in more parallel to the strings in order for the thumb pick to come down in the right spot. And that's cool, but it means that the rest of my fingers are hitting at a different spot on my fingertip and my nail than they would normally. So I don't quite get the same sound, and I haven't really wanted to totally reshape my nails to kind of accommodate that. And just generally, I don't find I enjoy the tone or the approach enough to justify that change. So it's just not something that I've dug into as much. But I will admit that it does open up some interesting possibilities, especially for maybe some palm muting or some different percussive attacks. And it certainly does have a certain rhythmic drive to it that is very satisfying. So I can see the appeal for sure. Now, hybrid picking, I have less investment in. It is something that maybe I'll get into more later on in life. It's just something that hasn't really grabbed me anytime recently because I kind of think of my flat picking and my fingerstyle as very separate. But I can see why people get into hybrid picking. Sort of similar to my approach with thumb pick, if I were going to try to work on it, I would find exercises that I can take from fingerstyle stuff that work well for that. So with a thumb pick, you can obviously still use all four fingers, but with hybrid picking, you're reduced down to just the three. So any three finger exercises, any kind of Travis picking things can definitely work well with a pick between your thumb and your index, and then you can kind of adapt from there. But I can't really give any more advice on that because it's just not something that I really dug into otherwise. So when it comes to classical exercises that I love for both warming up and for sort of consistently maintaining the independence and the refinement and the balance of all four fingers, the best ones in my book are the Giuliani right hand exercises, and those are featured in numerous resources, including Pumping Nylon, which is where I got them. I like these because the left hand stays simple and consistent, just a C to a G chord over and over, while the right hand works up in complexity and cycles through both 3 and 4 finger patterns over triplet, 16th, 8th, and triplet 16th patterns, some single note and others with chords mixed in. I like to set the metronome at 60 BPM throughout, using the slower paced ones to work on my attack, legato versus staccato, or work on bringing out a particular note over the others, while the faster ones do give me enough of a challenge, or I can always amp up the speed on those too. If I have a luxurious amount of time, I'll go through and do each and every one, maybe 1 to 2 times each, or if I'm a little bit more pressed on time, I'll pick 2 or 3 per page and sort of just do a quick speed run. Now, I'm not going to include these in my downloads because A, I don't have permission to, and B, they are readily available in lots of other resources, which I will link below. Not all of these patterns have really obvious musical utility in terms of, say, being easily turned into vocal accompaniment or some sort of chord melody accompaniment, but they are so valuable in the way that they help strengthen and fortify the independence of each finger. In the picking patterns that I'll feature later, I'll note the closest analogs in the Giuliani collections. And a new challenge that I thought of for myself would be to take some of my favorite patterns, maybe ones that aren't really intuitively obvious as good, musical pieces, and make a piece based around those patterns. So if you're interested in seeing that, let me know in the comments. I've also, as of late, been returning to the Carcassi etudes. I have this book which actually has a section of right-hand picking patterns somewhat similar to those Giuliani exercises, though less extensive. Plus it also has a ton of other exercises which I've barely scratched the surface of that are more challenging. I also found this download of the 25 etudes that's really well notated with right-hand markings, and while the bulk of it could be played with the right-hand finger assignments, there are instances where it breaks that structure, and there are also lines where you alternate the index and middle in single note runs, utilizing those fingers not just on the high strings, but on the bass strings as well. Overall, just a few that I've worked on have further developed my right hand sense and helped me to see the different ways that you can use the right hand fingerings and make them really optimized for a particular piece. Plus, beyond just right hand technique, they're also great for sight reading and for exercising your musical theory knowledge. If you've been following me for a while, you may already know that I have shared a couple sets of the Brouwer etudes, and currently I'm working on 7 through 9 for a future video. Like I mentioned in the caption on those videos, I love these tunes as they're great exercises just in general. They're funky, they're dissonant, they're kind of unexpected. They're not necessarily like the most musical thing in the world. You're not necessarily going to play them in a concert or something like that, but they present so many fun challenges both for the left and for the right hand, and they're a great way to work on your sight reading, to work on phrasing and dynamics. I just can't highly recommend them enough. Again, I'm not going to include them in my downloads because A, I don't have permission, and B, they are available in plenty of places, so I will link some of those below. All right, so now we're into the meat of this video, and that's the picking patterns that I actually functionally use in a lot of the music and tunes and arrangements that I play. For my Patreon backers, these will be available as written tabs for download. One quick note for folks who might not be familiar with classical notation, the left-hand fingerings are notated by numbers, so 1, 2, 3, 4, whereas the right-hand fingerings are notated by letters, and they're abbreviations for the Italian terms that apply to your thumb, index, middle, and ring finger. So 2 match up, but 2 don't. So you'll see P for thumb, I for index, M for middle, and A for the ring finger. So PIMA appears all over classical notation, and that's why. I think there is a ton of value in isolating these picking patterns and really drilling them. When I was first learning things, and still when I'm learning something, if I'm practicing something kind of new and weird for me, I will just take that pattern and play it over one chord over and over and over again until it feels really comfortable before I add in any chord changes at all. The right hand is the driver of the rhythm, and I feel that if you get that into a really rock solid place, it frees up a lot of mental energy to focus on your left hand, whereas if you're kind of tripping up on both, it's kind of hard to get anywhere. Plus, I kind of think the right hand might be more important because any mistakes you make there in the rhythm are going to catch the audience's attention more than if you make a small flub with your left hand, but you keep the rhythm in your right hand going. So again, I think it's just really worth isolating these and drilling them down until you're just super solid with them. First up, let's take a look at rolling arpeggios, which are just as they sound. Rather than playing all of the notes of the chord at once, you're breaking the notes up into a steady stream, typically going up and then potentially coming back down, depending on the time signature and the overall shape of the pattern. Now, that and the frequency of the chord changes will affect how your pattern plays out, but basically you're just thinking in terms of hitting the tonic and the bass on the downbeat of the change and rolling upwards and then back down in the time allotted. This style works great in Celtic tunes as well as for any slower song as vocal accompaniment. So in the first section, I've broken down how that pattern looks applied to chords with their tonic note on the E string, on the A string, and on the D string. It's the same pattern, it's obviously just going to change a little bit based on where your thumb starts. So for things with their tonic note on the E string, like the G chord, it's going to look like this. Chords like C that have their bass on the A string, you're starting there. And then starting on the D string, like the D chord. So you see the biggest change is just a matter of where the tonic bass is and where the alternating bass is that you want to go to. So in the case of chords with their tonic on the E and the A string, you are going upwards, you're going G to D, or in the case of E, you might be going E to B. Chords like C or chords like A, you're going to the next adjacent string up, so in that case the D string, so you're going C to E. Or in the case of A to E. And then the D chord is the one that changes the pattern a bit because you're starting up so high, so in order to get much of a satisfying alternating bass, you have to go down. So instead of going mess up the pattern, you go down to the low A. Not a super complicated concept, but one that can be a little bit of a hiccup causer if you're in the middle of trying to play something and you haven't really gotten the super down pat. So now I'll play through the C145 progression that I have written out from measures 4 through 12. In terms of the chords here, it's just the standard stuff. We've got regular C, and then for the F, I do the partial bar F, and I tend to move my ring finger kind of halfway through down to the C, and then replace it with my pinky on the F, so I can have that low C in the bass, and then back to C, and then I'll just do the regular G there. I'm doing just ring finger on the G there, and then pinky on the G there. I'm not doing any other notes because I'm not hitting this bass note, so I'm letting that finger take a break. So let's play through that now. 1, 2, 3, 4. And for anybody who's not familiar with that particular notation, so on that final C chord where it has the little squiggly line by the side of the notes, that just means break the chord up, basically. So rather than going, you go, just kind of do that quick little, it's almost like a super fast arpeggio. In the next section, I developed the same progression with just a little bit of added bass motion to make it just a little bit more interesting. The pattern there pauses for a second on the C chords and the G chord, where instead of doing this, that's upward thumb to index to middle to ring finger motion, it stops for a second and does thumb, index to bring out that bass motion. So here's what that sounds like. 1, 2, 3, 4. Next up, I'll play this pattern in triplet meter. Honestly, as nice as this upward rolling arpeggio is in 4/4, you have to sort of break the pattern in some way, either by going back to the bass on the third beat or working it out some other way, whereas in triplet meter time, you can just go up and come back down, landing on your next bass note on the one of the following measure. So like the 4/4 section, I have the pattern written out for chords with the bass in the E, the A, and the D. I won't play through all of those because it should be pretty obvious. We'll just jump right into the pattern over on measure 28. And this progression is a G major progression. We're going to go from the G chord to the E minor, to the A minor, to the D. And once again, it's very consistent, very repetitive. You're just moving around that thumb for the bass note. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. All right, so now we're going to go back to 4/4, but we're going to take that graceful up-down motion that we got with the triplet meter pattern, and we're going to apply that to 4/4, but we're going to change the sort of the structure of the pattern so that it takes that heavy emphasis off the 1 and the 3, puts it just on the 1, and sort of moves that second bass hit to the 4th beat, which is a lot less strong, so it's going to have a more flowy feel overall, and it's going to sound like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and... up to a slightly more natural playing pace. Next up in the downloads pack, you should find the go-to Travis picking patterns. And while this might not be the only version of Travis picking out there, there are some different variations I've seen people play. This is what I do a lot, and I know it's derived from Travis picking, so that's why I call it that. I also kind of think of it as the out, out, in pattern, because that's kind of what you're doing with your fingers. I've tried to break it down where it starts up from just the bass only, that nice alternating bass, and then builds up, adding the mids, just a little bit, and then more consistently until it's at its most dense point. And in that second line where it's very dense, that's really not how I would generally play it in context of a song. That is sort of the most important element, but usually I'm sort of mixing it up and throwing in some other high notes and varying the pattern a little bit. So I try to demonstrate that later on as well. Now, if you get nothing else from this video except for this pattern, that would be awesome. This is such a useful pattern to have. I can think of countless songs that this gets used in, both my own. I use it in Flowers of Rosendale, Lovely Molly, When I Was Not But Sweet 16. Paul Simon uses it a ton. You can hear him use it in Kathy's song. Joan Baez uses it. You can hear her using that on Sweet Sir Galahad. I mean, it's so utilitarian. You can put it into any folk song, probably tons of country songs and Americana songs as well, and it'll work great. It gives you a lot of room to play around with it. You can vary the pattern. You can add in melodies very easily. I think that's certainly why it has so much mileage and it's gotten so much use by so many different players. It's just so useful. So if you do nothing else but play this pattern, great. Something to note here is that while the rolling arpeggios featured all four fingers pretty equally, the ring finger was just as present as the thumb, index, and middle. In the case of Travis picking, these three fingers, your thumb, index, and middle, are the main drivers, while the ring finger kind of plays that secondary role where it's just coming in with a little bit of high note or the occasional melody or fill. So you're not going to see quite as many A's on the tab for this one. You're going to see mostly P's, I's, and M's. All right, so now we're going to dig into my go-to Travis picking pattern page. And as you can see from the top, it starts off with just the bass, which is by far the most important component. Having that nice, steady, strong alternating bass is really what makes this style. So start there. Don't pass that until that is really nice and solid for you. 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and... We're going to add in those mids. That full density portion is sort of what I think of as being the meat of this pattern, but it's also something that you don't necessarily want to do all the time. It's nice to be able to do that, and I definitely would suggest practicing that pattern really consistently over all your chords. But typically what you'll hear me and other people doing is breaking up that pattern with some slight variations. So throwing in some high notes using that ring finger. Because as you might have noticed, so far this pattern has mostly just been these three fingers. As discussed, these are sort of the primary drivers. There are a lot of ways to make this pattern more interesting, such as what you see on measure 9. 1, 2, 3, 4. Or measure 11. What I'll do is maybe have that little variation on the first two beats of a phrase and then go into the full density pattern. And then again, whenever there's a chord change, have a little bit of a variation. So now let's look at playing the G progression, going from the G to the C chord, to the A minor chord, to the D, back to the G, using the consistent pattern the entire time. 1, 2, 3, 4. See, that was entirely thumb, index, and middle, including on the D, which, like I discussed earlier on in this video, you're taking that whole pattern and you're just moving it up into those 4 strings. So you're not using your ring finger really at all because you want to maintain that nice thumb motion going from the D to the A. So once again, we'll do that same pattern, but with some natural variations, which we've already played through, so none of these should be a surprise. It'll just be in the context of a total progression. 1, 2, 3, 4. Last on this page, I have some of the pattern variations by chord. I just want to demonstrate that because what bass notes you play is going to depend a little bit on the chord and where within that chord shape the 1 and the 5 sit. So while on our G chord we're going from the low E string to the low D string, with our E minor or our E major, our 5th is now, it's not on the D string anymore, it's on the A string. So you're going. So I just wanted to write those different patterns out so you can see how it sort of changes the feel of it. And then for C, you should be pretty used to that by now. I will note that we are, for the most part, going C to E, though we are sometimes throwing in a G if we want to. That's an option that you'll see on option number 2. Works, and then D or D minor or F. Once again, you're focusing on using just these 3 fingers because it's also high up. So, but as you can see, I'm going D to A to low A back to the high A, just to have a little bit more motion to keep it a little bit more interesting for myself. Same thing with the F chord. Both of those cases, in any of those chords that start on the D string, you are hitting the tonic note on the 1 and you're having a lot more 5s in some cases, but you're still getting that tonic on the 1 and that's really what's going to define that chord, so it totally works. Lastly, in the download pack, you should find the rolling arpeggio hybrid pattern, which essentially kind of combines elements of the rolling arpeggios exercise that we did as well as the Travis picking style. So in this case, the thumb, index, middle are again going to be the main drivers of the pattern, but we are going to have a little bit of ring finger use, as you'll see. We'll just have to dig into this one to really explain it. So let's go. And as you can see, the first line is just 3 fingers, so we'll start off with that one and leave off that ring finger. We're just going to do the thumb, index, and middle. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and... Alright, so for this last pattern, starting on measure 5, we're going to add the ring finger on the high notes and make it a little bit more Travis-like. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and... Alright guys, so that is the mega overview of my right hand technique. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, if you made it through this whole video, you are definitely a guitar nerd too, and I appreciate it very much. I could definitely say more about this. I feel like once I started digging into making this video, I realized I have a lot of thoughts about this and a lot of strong feelings, but I try to distill it down into the most important things and the stuff that I thought would be the most useful for other people. So if you have further questions, let me know, and if any of this was helpful to you, I'd love to hear that too. If you have any further ideas or suggestions for future content like this, I would also love to hear that. Drop them in the comments. As I briefly mentioned, I'm thinking I will take some of these Giuliani exercises and turn them into little inspired pieces, so watch out for those in the future, and thanks again for watching this video. If If you want to support me and the work that I do, you can join me on Patreon at patreon.com/LindsayStraw. There you can join at a number of different tier levels and get access to special recordings and tabs and transcriptions and even lessons. So I hope that you'll join me there. Otherwise, just stay here, like and subscribe, etc., etc. And I'll see you next week with a music video and next month with another commentary tutorial video like this one. Thanks, guys.